Hey everyone, welcome back to for this final segment of the character design series. I'm really excited to get into this one today because we're finally gonna start rendering our characters and adding our final touches and all the nice shiny bits and polishing this character up. So you can see here, this is the sort of stage we're at now. So if you haven't watched the other videos yet, I highly suggest doing so, just to know sort of what we've gone through to get to this stage. We talked about character structure and posing and stuff. Talked a lot about costume design and adding details, and then last time we went through and iterated on a few color schemes. So what I've done since then is just stacking them one on top of each other, because we're gonna work in a way that is sort of like non-destructive and can be applied to any color scheme. So it's super flexible if you're working on a production and you need to do quick changes. The rendering basically is independent from the colors. The rendering is tied into the materials because materials are rendered differently. For example, a metallic will be really, really shiny, where a cloth like a cotton or jeans or something might be much more matte. And metallics and versus other materials are just react with light differently. So we need to consider that when rendering. It is pretty flexible though, like we can sort of adjust the contrast of the rendering with the masks that we have out of our color flats. So if I go into my color flat layer here, we can quickly select these different sections of the flats, which means that if we render on another layer and we go to this one and select one of those areas, we can go back to our rendering layer and then switch up the contrast, maybe add some specular highlights just in those areas. And we'll be kind of going back and forth to select certain parts once we get a base render going. So so the way I'm gonna work is I'm gonna start by just doing a very universal render pass on this. So I'll set my line art to linear light. That way, maybe I'll just set it to like 25%. So that doesn't affect things too much. I'll hide the other layers underneath for now. And I will lock my flats layer and my line art because I really don't want to render on them. And that'll prevent me. You can see it locks my brush, so I can't actually do anything. And on this layer, we're just gonna start kind of rendering this in black and white. So actually, before I'm gonna talk a little bit about what kind of lighting scheme I'm gonna do, and I'll make a sphere on the side to illustrate this. So the way I'm gonna render is with one key light, and just with one key light you already have all the information that you need to show form and volume and materials. So but there are a lot of components to just having one light source. So anytime you add a light source, you need to rethink all those components. So I'm gonna kind of try to render this from a pretty straight on lighting. So my light source will be sort of like top, maybe a little bit toward one side. So maybe it's a little bit towards the right here. So my core shadow will be quite low. Something like this. that's kind of going to be what I go for. Then there's also going to be a cast shadow. For every volume, there's always going to be a cast shadow that it creates, at least if it overhangs something else. So it might be something like this. It won't quite be as harsh as sunlight. It will be closer to a studio lighting setup. So there's a little bit of fall off on the shadows, which kind of is more forgiving than really harsh shadows like you get from the sun. Just because they don't need to be as accurate to still look good. And then, of course, so we have actually, I'll name all the components afterward, but there are a lot of like different parts to all of this. And then maybe here we have just a little bit of, actually I shouldn't separate these again, redo that. Something like that. And maybe we have a small specular highlight. So this is a really good exercise. This is, just painting up a sphere, trying to capture the volume. But now I'll kind of go through and name all the different parts of this rendering, right? So, I'm looking for a pen or something. Let's bring that up. We'll do no shape, no texture, no transfer. Yeah. So, so the main part, the highlight, that will be almost your lightest light, but then you have a specular highlight. So I'm just gonna put spec here. That's gonna be your brightest area. Then you have your going into the shadow. Here you have what is the terminator of the shadow, which is going to be the darkest part of your shadow. And it can also be called like the core shadow. I'm just going to call it CS. Then in between basically your highlight and your shadow, you have this sort of transition area, and this is called your halftones. It's really, really important to get these halftones right to show the form. Halftones. Because depending on the gradient, you have basically a gradation from dark to light, and depending if that gradation happens like really quickly, like that, or more gradually, it'll show a different curvature. And so the best way to practice this is just to draw a lot of primitive shapes, just practice rendering different forms. Rendering anatomy is a super good way of practicing this, because anatomy has such complex organic shapes that you need to really manage your halftones to show the form. Then we have, in here, we have kind of two components of the shadow. So we have the cast shadow. And in the cast shadow, we have a darker area that's closer to the sphere, which is I think it's called the penumbra or ambient occlusion. there's a couple different names for it, but basically there's an area that no light gets to. And so this area here, I'm just going to call it AO, which is what is most often referred to in 3D. So that'll be basically the darkest part of the shadow. And then in between, in your shadow, you'll sometimes get right in between, I'm just going to point right here. So you'll have some reflected light or bounce light. But this is basically light that's coming from the light source and bouncing back up into the shadow. Now this reflected light is never going to be lighter than your darkest halftone, which is to say, like, your halftones live within the family of the things that are in light, and as soon as you pass the terminator, you're in the family, you're the group of everything that's in shadow. So the brightest part of your shadow is never going to be lighter than the darkest part of your highlight or your what's in the light source. So that's a really important rule to adhere to for rendering realistic objects, or have realistic rendering. So that's some stuff to keep in mind. I'm gonna hide these notes for now, and just keep this sort of sphere on the side as a reminder. And let's get into rendering. So I work from big to small, and I try to stay away from going completely black. So I'm starting with mid-gray and maybe going to 60 or 70%. And this is going to be just blocking out all my shadows. So I'm kind of treating the main shape. So I know the head is kind of like a sphere. So I'm going to render it sort of the same way as I would have started rendering the sphere. I know that this shape here is sort of a sphere, so I'm going to kind of give that some roundness. This, I know that there's some roundness to the chest and torso. So throwing in some shadow there. These are basically cylinders, so I can treat the arms as such. The same thing for the legs. So I'll add a little bit more shadow on the left side, since I want my light source to be coming slightly more from the right. And then here we'll have like a cast shadow from the legs. And then these I can kind of treat like cylinders too. And kind of getting the base, like if you zoom out far, you can see that I've basically laid out the primary shapes with the rendering. And then you go in to define. It's very much like sculpting in 3D. You need to figure out your primary shapes, and then you go into figuring out your secondary shapes, and then detailing and all that stuff. So now I'm laying in some cast shadows. I'm doing this without reference because I'm really looking at the main forms that I drew. Remember that when I designed this, I pulled reference for shapes and proportions of things, but not really for folds or for the design of the garment. Because, well, as a designer, you should probably design the stuff, the garments and the clothing, and not just take a design that already exists. But now I might go back and get reference that are specifically for folds and for materials, just for values and stuff, just to make it a little bit easier to render something that's believable. I'm just going in another board. So now I have basically my primary shapes laid out. And you can see that my shadows are still quite light. So now I can go a tad darker and maybe start pushing and occluding certain areas that light would have a harder time getting to, like under the arm here. You might have some ambient occlusion under this here. I'm not doing any cast shadows yet because I'm just working on all the well, I'm doing the cast like showing the cast shadows is done by showing the boundary between the light and the shadow, but I'm only working with shadow right now. There's no light. I haven't cast any light on the object. So I'm just, this is like the lightest color right now is just the local value, but there's no like highlight. So I'm just kind of laying in the shadows, and the cast shadows will show up when I put in the highlights, if that makes sense. But you'll see when I get there. So here, looking a little bit into the shapes of these folds and kind of trying to resolve how the physics is working, kind of like how it simulates, like how the cloth folds over itself. Do a lot of cloth studies to see how these work. It's almost like origami in a lot of ways. Like you need to figure out how a flat plane or a flat surface folds onto itself. So I'm thinking this fabric here could maybe be like silk or something that's quite reflective, almost metallic. Could be fun. And we can push the contrast and stuff and bring out really sharp highlights a little bit later on. I know in the design I talked a little bit about this this pattern that the folds create and how it might be interesting to accentuate that with the lighting. So we can check that. Here we have, we'll go a little bit darker under here. These are facing away from the light. And now these are kind of like cylinders in themselves, so they'll have some halftone, kind of showing how round they are. I'll have the shape of the face, or some occlusion under the neck and the hair. Now kind of revealing the shape of the skull and the shapes of the face. So everything is very soft right now, and that is kind of like you want to make sure that you have sharp edges in your render. I just like to work from softer edges toward hard edges rather than having hard edges everywhere and then having to soften them. And that's just personal preference. You have a lot of artists working with really hard brushes and going for a very graphic approach to their rendering, which can be really valuable, especially in certain in certain styles. Here we'll add some occlusion. I'm also going to set my eyedropper to current layer only as well. So I'm just selecting from these gray this black and white layer. And I think it's about now I'll start laying in some highlights. So I'm gonna go a little bit over my mid-gray. And I have flow set on my brush, so some of this will be quite subtle. And I'll start pulling out some highlights. And I do want to stay on the on the left when I'm working in this orientation, and then on the right when I'm switching on to this orientation. I find I've done the mistake often where I flip my canvas and I still keep the light source coming from the left, and I end up having basically two light sources instead of one, because I forget to switch my light direction when I flip my canvas. I'll try not to do that. And pull out some highlights here. I might work back in. At this point, it's really, you're pulling highlights and you're pushing shadows with value. So you're very much sculpting the form with light. And as you're painting it, or as you're rendering, it should feel like that. It shouldn't feel like there's like white paint. It shouldn't feel like you're adding white paint or dark paint on your figure. It should be like you're pushing and pulling a shape. So here I have this fold, which is going to cast a shadow, and then I have the core shadow, a little bit of ambient occlusion. I'm constantly thinking about how this would render. Like what is every part, what is every component of the light on these forms. And what kind of underlying forms are there? Because I know there's the leg under here, but the cloth needs to drape onto it, so there's tension, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening, and that's how you sort of sell the effect of cloth. Is that not only do you need to show the shape of the cloth, but you need to show what it's draping over. So that's starting to be a little too bright. Feels like paint. And this part I find really meditative. I know a lot of artists who hate rendering find it like super long and boring, but I think that designing can be really quite mentally draining and exhausting if you do it for really long periods of time, because there's so much problem solving involved. And rendering is like, at least once you know how it works, it's almost the equivalent of pressing a button and waiting for for a render to pop out if you've used like a render engine or something. You just kind of turn off. You can listen to music, you know, just hang out. You kind of just slowly see your design come to life. So I think I'll mostly be rambling about stuff this episode because I mean, it's rendering. I think a big part of rendering is also just creating interesting shapes for shadows and highlights and stuff. So sometimes, especially for more illustrative and stylized work, kind of simplifying shapes of highlights and shadows and stuff can be really can add a lot to a render. I'm starting to add different kinds of edges and variation to show overlaps. It's still quite soft, but it's starting to reveal some of those forms. Often folds will create kind of like zigzag shapes where tension happens. Or compression, I should say. Because it kind of acts like a spring. Higher density detail there. And here we add a bit of a sharper highlight. I'm not going to go too crazy though, because we can always, I do want to reserve my lightest lights for the very end, and I do want to keep this all in black and white. So, a little that. Here I'm going to have a cast shadow, I think. Yep. So there's an overlap here. So this will be a pretty deeply recessed shadow. And here and there we can sort of occlude that even more. Here the fold turns away, so you'll have a bit of that core shadow and then some ambient occlusion. And here. And then I can kind of design the shape of this halftone to be a little bit more structured. Highlight too. It just starts to show a little bit the like the structure of the cloth. So some more rigid cloths you'll often see like memory folds, which are basically creases in the cloth that happen just from wearing it, and it adds a bit of a surface breakup. That's really nice, especially when you're kind of building those materials in 3D, to have that little bit of material breakup, like you can see right here. It just adds a little bit of interest. here we have nice sharp highlight. As if the cloth is bunching up. And then you'll have some reflected light. Back to that part later. Yeah, part's going to be a little bit tricky to resolve the how this stuff folds over itself. Come back to that part later. I'm liking this upper part though. Sometimes the bunching at the bottom can be tricky. All this stuff happening, and you don't want it to look like an amorphous blob. You want it to look like a single thin piece of I don't want to say fabric, but it's like a single, almost like a two-dimensional plane that's folding over itself. There's no volume like necessarily to it. It creates like a volume, but there's very little volume to the actual fabric. So you don't want to make it feel like a blob, but more like paper that's folding and creasing into itself and stuff. So let's do the shoes, get those out of the way. You don't want to ignore feet or any part of the design for that matter. Everything is equally important. Like, at least if you're shooting for realism, this is where using our colors underneath can really help us with creating masks. Because if I go to this color layer and select this, for example, I can go back to my rendering layer and just work in that area. If I go to this side, add a little highlight, and we'll refine this once we start grouping together the material and the value and the color, all like when we start looking at all of it at once. Shadow. But the most important thing is to just get that separation in volumes. You don't want any of your surfaces to look flat and two-dimensional, especially in like the first read. Because that just gives the wrong signal to the viewer, whether it be the art director or an art director, I should say, or a 3D character, like a 3D modeler. the initial read on the concept should be really clear. So here I've added a little bit of shadow to the sides that are facing away from the light. You can also press Control H, which will hide the selection, but will keep your selection. So that can be useful too. Just getting those main volumes down, showing that it's wrapping around the foot. Might be occluded a little bit under the pant leg. Okay, Control D. Now onto the soles. Keep those nice and simple. And I'm going to erase the line art that's a little bit distracting on the skin here. Go back to my rendering layer, lock that, and then a little bit of ambient occlusion under there, same here. It's pretty like, I think I go about it in a really methodical way, but I guess it works out for the most part. I mean, ideally you just understand the forms and you understand how lighting works to the point where you basically put on your rendering engine hat and go ham. Because if you understand the forms, like of the anatomy, then you know where the plane changes occur, what direction things are facing in. And if you know that, then you know where to render, where to put highlights, where to put shadows, and all that fun stuff. You can see I'm switching between my flats and my rendering layer so that I can quickly select those colors and stuff. Okay, so we've got that kind of roughed out. So now we kind of got the legs done. We can move toward the torso. I like to keep the funnest stuff for the end because it just keeps things interesting. You get the most rewarding part after you've done all the hard work. So now, for example, there's a bit of a flat plane here. And then you'll get a highlight on the finger, some shadow here. And this is probably from rendering hands a lot. Kind of find a shorthand. I'm actually going to unlock this and adjust the shape of the hand now because there's some weirdness happening in the silhouette. Let's do a little bit of that. Then we can another good trick is selecting and then Control-Shift inverting, Control-Shift-I to invert the selection, and that way you can add shadows and stuff without affecting an area. So let's say I wanted to paint around here, and Control-Shift-Invert, and that keeps it on the hand. So that's really useful to create ambient occlusion under an area, or just work around a certain selection. And we can Control Shift invert again. Bring in some highlights on this side. Remember, I'm still using this lighting scheme from the sphere, so I'm treating every little finger as if it were its own sphere. So here you'll have shadow coming underneath, and I'm going to go into my line art and erase these sort of distracting lines. I only really need to know where the fingers are placed, because the wrist is just one shape. It's basically just a cylinder, so as long as the silhouette is right, I don't really need any other information. And here, I know that the nail is going to have a bit of a highlight. This is much more glossy, and it's almost always more glossy unless for some reason you put matte nail polish on, which might be a thing. I don't think I've seen that actually. And here, adding some shadows for the other fingers. Cast shadow from the thumb. Cast shadow from the other finger. See that even that, when you zoom out, it really adds dimension. It's much better than ignoring the hand altogether and then you just have a sort of mess of a thing. A blobby thing happening on this side of the arm or at the end of the arm. And here it's normally a little bit flatter. You have a tendon at the top of your thumb. There. When you open your hand, you might see the tendon flare out. And all those little details add believability to and realism. Sharpen some of this up. Some deeper shadows in here. Okay, we're starting to get somewhere. And sort of redesign the shape of that cast shadow. Actually, I might adjust the silhouette here too. I think what's happening is that there's actually, you're seeing the pad under the pinky on the other side of the thumb. So the thumb shape is actually here. Anyways, good enough for now. Hands are always tricky. Render. Same here. I'm going to sort of erase out the line art. that. So here I'll start to reveal the cast shadow by adding highlights. So you can see by starting the highlight there, I'm showing the cast shadow of the piece of fabric on top. I don't want to go too dark here because it's starting to face away from the light. And then here, this is facing towards the light again. Here I'll mark where I think that cast shadow is going to go. So something like that. Then it'll step up really close. Maybe something like that. This is all going to be in highlight. This is kind of flaring out and then kind of rotates around the form. Add a little bit of surface variation where it kind of flattens out. Now here it's also valuable to check. Do I have the? Where is it? I don't think I kept the base body. I'm just gonna. Under. Oh, I deleted something. Oh well. I guess I deleted something from the file. But if you have your base body under, if you kept your base body from earlier, definitely lower the transparency of your design and check that your rendering still makes sense with the body underneath. Sometimes you'll see that once you did the whole base body thing, you designed on top of it, everything's working well, and then you get into rendering and it looks like you might have dislocated limbs or the clothing isn't draping properly on the body because you're not considering the shape of the anatomy, the underlying anatomy. So that's just worth checking, especially if you haven't done it a ton and you're not used to translating those shapes. It's good to check, just a way to check your work. Now I want a bit of a tension fold going across. So that might be something like that's quite bright. Foreshadow, cast shadow. Might play with that a little bit and see if I can design something interesting. Here, adding some highlights on the straps and again revealing those cast shadows with highlights. Highlight on this main belt. This is basically facing directly into the light, right? So you can go quite bright. Here you'll have some rivets, and then these cylinders will have start with the highlights here. And then maybe they have a little bit of a sort of turning, they have that little crimped part of the fabric. There, shadow under. Oh, I've got some color in that. I'm almost rendering this like a matte cap or just like a clay render where everything has a similar, has the same local value. You just might have a little bit of a difference in materiality. So here I'm giving it a much hotter highlight because it's metal. This is when it starts to become really satisfying. You get that little sparkle and all those volumes start to play. Might have a little bit of bounce light on the bottom of the metal, so that's coming out nicely. And then I'm gonna have I think it's gonna be quite metallic here too. So you'll have a highlight on that edge to show that there's thickness to it. And maybe on this one, a bit of a shoulder pad. So that'll come facing back into the light. And then these will be turned away quite a bit as the form rounds the shoulder. Something like that. Also get a highlight on this edge and shadow under here. Every form. It's got to be really rigorous about showing. I mean, you went through all this effort to design a character and to have things, putting things in a certain area and designing the shapes and stuff. So might as well kind of spend some time to polish it up and give it justice. I'm not sure if this is in part of the, yeah, so here I kind of have misleading line art. So I'm just going to erase, oh, I can't erase that. I'm just going to erase that here and, oh, there, erase that. Go back to that, go to this, kind of darken this again. And then use that as a selection to bring out those highlights. Here. Like that. And you can see here the anti-aliased edge, but when you're zoomed out, you don't really see it. So some more anatomy, cast shadow of the chin, a little bit of ambient occlusion. And here you have the jacket, which will be quite dark. It's a thick material, nothing's getting through that. Cast shadow here. Maybe the belt here catches just a little bit of light before going into the jacket, so you can see that overlap. Thick material's got some structure to it. Here. I'm not dealing with a pattern yet. The pattern will come a little bit later. We'll still render it, but I just want to remember it's like primary, then tertiary, or primary, secondary, then tertiary. Here I have a bit of a cast shadow. Here the form turns away a little bit. This will all be occluded. Maybe this is catching a little bit of bounce over here. And then here, bottom of the cast shadow, that's going over that way. So here we can sort of reveal, again, it's like revealing the shadow with light by adding light instead of just adding shadow. It's like you're kind of working back and forth between light and shadow. It sort of flares out. This is facing almost straight into the light too. So as I'm adding in the light, quote unquote, you can see in my palette here that I'm still pretty dark. Like I still have almost half the value spectrum at my disposal to add more highlights, and that's really important to give yourself that leeway, because if you start crunching all your values from the get-go, it's really hard to find basically you run out of value real estate pretty quick. Like if my value scheme was like, looked more like this, yeah, which is really easy to do when you're starting out. You think like you need to use everything from black to white, but you really don't. You can use like this looks so flat in comparison, but you'll see that once I finish, like you don't need as long as you have all the components of light that you have in this sphere, like the highlights, the core shadow, the bounce light, the cast shadow, like you can show volume with very little contrast. Contrast is kind of just a final thing that like it just depends how you want to present your character. If you want to make it really dramatic, then you kind of crank up the contrast. If you want, for concept art, I find low contrast is really important because you need to show the delineation. Like you're not there to show the drama and of the character. Like you're trying to show the design, and if your design is lost in super dark shadows and really bright highlights, then it kind of defeats the purpose of doing a design. So even in the darkest shadows, you'll be able to see hopefully you'll be able to see the overlap in materials and stuff, or overlap in the garment, and like you want to see what's happening in the shadows as much as what's in the highlight. Okay, kind of moving up towards the head slowly but surely. Here, maybe we can get a couple of these folds in. It's gonna create a shadow there. Kind of styling some of these folds. I might pull up reference for this in a bit. I want to make them more believable. I'll kind of just push it. I think I'll lighten the whole thing, actually, because it's quite dark. If I select this, I still want to. So I'm getting pretty dark, and I'm running out of room. Out of darkest darks to deal with, to get that ambient occlusion and stuff in. Here, under here. Okay. I think I'm getting somewhere. Okay, let's work on the face a little bit. So I'm gonna correct this silhouette first. Bring that in a little bit. Erase this distracting line. I'm gonna ignore this hair for now, and I'm just gonna concentrate on the planes of the face. Facing down a little bit. You'll have the temple, the cheekbone. You'll have the nose, cast a small shadow. It's not quite going to be like a Rembrandt where like the whole side of the nose. I'm not going to go for this kind of lighting because it's not that sideways. So this is really, yeah, I really need to control my halftones to show the form without without having too much contrast. So here, the bottom lid. I'm gonna try to find where the lightest part of the face is gonna be, probably close to here. And then on the forehead, it's actually going to be like right here. So I can kind of gradiate away from that. Maintaining the roundness of the head. I wouldn't go add a really bright highlight over here. Because that would sort of defeat the purpose of adding the sharp highlights on this side, which shows the form of the skull. Here you'll have a bit of a lift. Up there. And the top lip faces down a little bit. And then the bottom lip. Rolls over. Adding a little highlight to the corner of the mouth can help to show that it's kind of like folding in to into the mouth, I guess. Bottom of the chin is really rolling under and away from the light, so it'll get quite dark. Cast a pretty dark shadow onto the neck. Show that overhang. Same for the back of the cheek. You're not going to get any bounce light on this side, really, from the hair or anything. Okay. I can play a little bit with the features. I bring this back a little bit. Kind of use the line art as a guide. this point, I'm actually going to take the line art of the face and the hair. Actually, this whole part here up to the bandana. I'm going to separate it and merge it with the shading. So now if I take away the shading, you can see I don't have a face anymore. But I've mostly defined like most of the highlights. Like I know where the features and stuff are placed. So just to have that extra control over the value and what's happening in with detailing out basically the face. I don't want to be working under my line art. I do want to like use the line art though as information. So I just merge them together and bring a highlight into the nose. You can also use a reference. I'm not really using any reference, so this is a bit of a non-specific head, just a head from imagination, I guess. It is a head that I'm trying to make look good, just as a generic head. I'm making sure that the anatomy is in the right place and that the landmarks are in the right place and that the shapes are kind of reading like a head and not like a wonky blob of some sort. So I can make these small adjustments to the line art. Feel and just you often get bounce light on the bottom of the nose with pretty harsh lighting, but you'll get a pretty sharp core shadow under the tip of the nose, which makes it seem like it really gives volume to the nose. Like it makes it feel like it protrudes out of the face. You have the Cupid's bow. Where's my cuts up there? Is this gonna reflect? I'll add a little bit of reflected light to the side of the chin, just for funsies. Maybe there's something reflecting off the shirt. Chin just a tad. Yeah, I think that's okay for now. Now we can work on some of the hair shapes. If you have if you've tagged along so far, or drawing along, thanks for doing so. I hope you're learning something and that I'm not boring you to death. and I'm sure in a few minutes you'll see the satisfying result of all this labor when we composite the render with the color flats, and we see it all come together. So stick around. For the hair, I'm gonna stay pretty loose with it. We might go, I think that sort of stuff is really fun to do straight in color once you kind of merge things together and do a final pass. So I'm getting like main kind of highlight shapes in, and then kind of leaving the rest for later. I'm getting that main circular shape to the bandana. Here, that's a bit of a sphere or a cylinder. Maybe the light catches like just the end of it. Just right here. Little highlight. Yeah, it's folding over. I like to give everything just a little bit of thickness. You can always thin things out, but to have thickness on everything just makes it easier to model. Makes everything clear. Play a little bit with the shape of this cheekbone and the half tones because it's kind of harsh. Don't want it to be that harsh. Remember, like, my lighting's pretty straight on, so I don't need to exaggerate that stuff so much. And here, the white of the eyes. Oh, we're getting into details now. This is like a little bit of makeup. Kind of feels like yeah, savvy pirate. Keep a little bit highlight on the cheek. Yeah, so see, like, very small things in the halftone can make it feel like can really change the volume. Like if I wanted her to be like pushing out her cheek, right? Like she's chewing on something. You can see all I need to do is that. And it completely makes it look really weird. So really subtle changes in the halftone, especially when you're working on like a clean, very polished render. You need to be really careful in like managing those shapes and making sure that they're describing what you want them to describe. This, if you don't see my liquefy pop up, it's because I'm only doing a window capture and not a a screen capture, but I promise you these changes are really subtle, and they're just using the like move or forward warp tool, the first tool in a liquify palette. So just making subtle changes like that to get things aligned. Okay, so I'd say this is like a first render pass. So we have most of our shapes being described. Let's soften some of these things. Rendering can just go on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. And I'll probably spend a few hours on this, at least a couple. We're already an hour and 20 minutes into this portion of the tutorial, but let's get to compositing flats and then we can work on the render afterward, or continue. So the nice part about this is I can just set this to something like linear light, maybe drop the fill a little bit, and yeah, and there you go. You're like 90% done your rendering. But yeah, the nice thing about linear light is that you can sort of adjust the like by adjusting the fill, you keep saturation in your colors. It's quite easy to do metallics because you just kind of, for example, if I wanted to change this copper thing into a metallic, I can select it, bring up my levels, and just kind of bring the whites and darks in, and get like extra sharp like glossiness out of it if that's, I wanted to change the material. And the other thing is, in my layer stack here, I have all my shadow on one thing, and if I wanted to see it, maybe what it looks like on another model, I just transfer it over, and so now this is what it looks like on that one. And I could continue working and iterating on that. Now I think I have the line art duplicated on this one. So let's just continue working on this one. Snap that there. So I kind of like this, what's happening here. So now I can get into more specific things like rendering materials. So let's make this more of like a metallic. So I'm gonna kind of really blast out the highlights here. Maybe there's a couple secondary ones. Maybe here we have like the dark reflections of the coat on top, right? So here you would have the reflection of the pants, and then do a little bit of detailing here. And if the that color isn't getting enough range out of it, I can kind of like change the color to get a bit more of that like super bright highlight. But it seems to be working pretty well for me. So here, the edge, and let's trim there. And then here. So now I'm kind of just refining the material. Kind of make things pop a little. And also Control H to hide the selection if you want to make little bevels or stuff. You can see like the edge a little bit better. So you get a nice, you get that extra control. Could also add a little bit of like Fresnel reflections on the side, but we'll also do one layer that sort of passes over everything to get that to get some of that final polish. Is this on the right thing? There. Just drop that down a little. Dig in. Is this working? Oh, it's because I have a selection. Digging into these materials. Now remember, I have my eyedropper set to current layer, so I'm not actually selecting the color. I'm selecting the gray, values of gray from this layer, because it's all black and white. So you can see what's happening on my color picker as I'm going through. It's just values of gray and not actual colors. And some tertiary breakup in the material. Just some little imperfections, I guess. Also add occlusion. Use the selections to my advantage. Sometimes the edges can look really flat, and just adding that little bit of shadow on the very, very far edge can add a lot of volume. Like it really makes the volume pop out. Adding a couple tension folds. I do want to really make it clear where the cast shadow is. So I'm kind of going to delineate that with a darker, something like that. Separate the shadows out from the highlights. Here for this section. Add some seam lines. It's where you're really coming in and refining all the little details. So here you might have some small folds or something. I really love adding these little imperfections to the material, the surface breakup and stuff. So here. And the thing is, it doesn't, like, I'm not I'm not a fabric simulator of any sorts. So I'm taking these calculations only to a certain level, and then I'm kind of just thinking about the graphic design of the folds, if it looks cool or not. Because folds, especially, like, most of the time it's more important that you design the folds in an interesting way than getting them perfect. Because when people are modeling them, you can simulate it using something like Marvelous Designer. Or I'm gonna actually bring I'm gonna bring this all the way up. So because this is set to linear light, if I take the fill all the way down, then I run out of range. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to crunch. So it starts from 50% gray. So I'm going to fill it with 50% gray on top. There. And I'm going to lower the opacity of this until... how can I do this? If I fill it like that. Yeah, so I'm going to try to basically cut the fill in half by filling this with 50% gray and then like merging it down. You can see that it gets me back to the same fill that I had before, except now when I add darker values, I can actually go dark. So maybe that was a little too high, so I'm going to drop the opacity. Maybe that was a little too low. Yeah, there you go. Something like that. Just kind of preserving my value range. And yeah, and then we can continue pushing our darks darker and our highlights a little bit lighter. But if I put this back to normal, you can see how low contrast it is. This linear light is very powerful. It's much more powerful than overlay or hard light. So you get a lot of range out of it. It's like HDR shading. So here I can kind of push the sort of highest, the highlights in the leather. Really working up to my brightest brights and darkest darks. pushing the contrast in the metal. Actually, on the metal, I'm going to change this center part. I think where the hammer hits the metal to like a different kind of color. I think this is normally steel or something. So that's going to be a different color. It's just a bit of a tertiary detail. Now we can get into maybe working on this pattern a little bit. Kind of just thinking about what kind of shapes I want and how the highlight is going to affect it, so that I don't have to paint absolutely everything. I can just do a sort of relief version of it. I'm going for a floral pattern thing. We have some stuff happening here. And then as it gets out of the highlight, it's going to be less high contrast. To here. Still considering where the light direction is coming from. Work all the way down. Here I'm almost just showing like what's higher than the rest. I'm almost just drawing the highlight down here, and I'm going to knock it back quite a bit just because it's not in the highlight anymore, and you can see that gives that bit of a metallic feel to it when the highlight's pretty much only in the, or when the detail's only in the highlight. And I'm going to kind of go in between some of these parts and just make it more high frequency, I guess. There's more breakup. It'll sort of even out the surface. Here. Take some of that. Just kind of designing shapes. And then filling the in-between with more shapes. I feel floral. So, and yeah, maybe catches the light every once in a while. Maybe this has a bit of a... It's mostly about just like giving the impression of detail. If you were to do design callouts or something, then you for sure would actually design this pattern and apply it in a more believable way, or like in a clearer way. This is just like impression. So here, and we can actually like select this, which is on our shadow layer, and duplicate it, and kind of bring it over to this side so we don't have to repaint the whole thing. Where is that? There, something like that. And if we take this, like if we go to our flats layer here, and go outside of that layer, we can just delete what's on the outside, and then erase some of that, erase some of this so that it merges nicely. Maybe we maybe we just bring up the value a little bit. Oh, maybe not that much. No. Maybe just go back a couple steps. And how can I do this? I'm going to set this to normal. This I'm going to bring down and set it back to linear light. There. And I'm just going to kind of fill in the blanks here. Why is this? Oh, it is not going off. Here, maybe adding a little bit of metallicness. Metallics are basically only reflection, so they you really need to be aware of like what's surrounding them and make sure that you kind of reflect it into the surface. So like you'll have, let's say the light is coming off from this direction and it bounces and hits this. Some will come straight to the camera, but some will bounce into this and some will bounce into this, so you can get these sort of like hot spots on metals. That's why you get so much variation in glows and highlights and stuff, which are always fun to draw. Also use, when you're working on your values, different blending modes for your brush, which will give like a, it applies the paint in a different way. Might affect different value range, which can be kind of nice. example, if I set it to overlay, it will kind of like really apply in an aggressive way. Compared to normal, or even like dissolve, for instance. You know, if you want to have sparkles behind clear. Oh, I've never used those. Those are new to Photoshop. Interesting. I'll need to play with those. Detail out some of this stuff. Get a little bit of bounce light off of that. Another thing you can do if you want just sharper highlights without going through and manually putting them in, and sometimes it works for some things, but you can duplicate a surface and set it to like pin light, and I'm actually going to put this on normal for now. So I have this new surface, and when it's set to pin light, you don't change anything about it. It shouldn't change anything. But if you crank the levels, bring up like the highlights, for instance, and crush the shadows, kind of get into this sort of range here. You can sometimes add some interesting little effects. Oh, isn't it changing? So I just want it to affect. Man, my like pen is sticking. Ugh. Anyways, I'll set it to that. And on the fill, maybe. Yeah, something like that. Adds a little bit of glossiness. And then when I set this back to linear light, you can see it added a bit of a glossy effect. Now some of it is kind of artifacty, so I'm going to clean this up. Gives me a range, something to color pick from, to get that silk look on the pants. And let's actually let's do some more folds. Really push this. Go back. Here. Can you even go into texturing some stuff? Here, so here I have a brush that has a little bit of grain to it, and I can use that to kind of add some little bit of texture to this cloth, as if it's not like what is it called? I forget. It's kind of escaping me, but if I set it to overlay, just go here. Yeah. I don't know, just adds a little bit of something, a little something, something. Texture of the cloth, and adds little interesting moments. I only really use texture brushes in this sort of final step where we're really pushing materials and stuff, or else it can become kind of noisy if you're dealing with texture brushes in the earlier phases. And even then, I'm gonna knock a lot of this back with just a normal brush. I'm just kind of laying it in. Just gotta highlight there, some shapes here. A lot of little noisy things, but silk is complex and get pretty sharp folds, small folds out of silk. And now I can knock these back with the normal brush, or a brush with no massive texture on it, so I leave like an impression of the texture, but it's not like overwhelming the whole thing. Adding a little bit of reflected light on the bottom of those volumes just gives it a little something. Also seeing pretty sharp. I have a couple references up just looking at how the material acts and kind of, I don't know, the hierarchy of the folds, I guess. So many levels of difficult, complex, weird overlaps and shapes. Love this sort of challenge. I'm just getting that. Sometimes this is almost looking like plastic now. So it's also worth doing a lot of material studies where you kind of study the properties of materials so you know what makes plastic different from silk. Like, is it how bright the highlights get? Is it is it the texture? Most often it's the way light scatters through a material that changes it, differentiates it from something else. But knowing exactly like what parameters what are the actual values of the, like how bright the light actually gets on silk versus how bright a highlight gets on anything else. I see it gets really quite bright, and which is why I'm sort of building up to the lights. You can see when I really crank it, it pops. There you go. There you go. That's starting to look like what I want it to look like. And now I'm gonna keep the sort of highlight of the leg underneath in mind as I'm doing these highlights that cut across everything. So you have like this sort of thing, this sort of thing. All these little compression folds and stuff. Might need to adjust my silhouette a little bit to show that information. Show the little overlaps and stuff. And here, these like big swooping lines that cut across with all these little side a little bit. Most often texture will show up at the boundary between light and shadow, so you can kind of pick like to start my texture in the highlight and then fade it off as it goes into shadow so that it doesn't become too like dominating everywhere and noisy. This needs to adjust some of these shapes that I don't really like. And like I was saying earlier, adjusting some of the silhouette to show those overlaps. Yeah, that sells the thickness a little bit better. Just lock that again. Come in here with some pretty dark shadows and really push that back. I'll add a little bit of a rogue fold here. It's sort of folding in and out. And maybe it curls So this side's proven to be pretty tricky. I mean, it's kind of pretty tricky everywhere, but it's been giving me an especially difficult time. I think it's just sometimes I might just get the base structure wrong. But you keep working at it and you figure it out. Maybe I'm just slowly shifting stuff around until it feels right. I kind of want to make it feel like there's tension. I don't know. Tension or no tension, because it is crumpling up at the bottom. Get pretty dark. Now I can come back in with like overlay and my texture brush and kind of just give these a little punch. I love little moments like this where you can just throw in a highlight, get a really sharp edge on something. So cutting through with a knife. Here I'm kind of gonna bring out that cast shadow. Top there. Okay, those look like glossy pants, I think. A big thing for any reflective surfaces is the Fresnel reflections, which are the reflections that naturally occur on the edge of glossy things. So that would basically look like this, where you have it almost like a rim light, but it's not a light. It's just reflecting the ambient light of the environment closer to the edges. So you kind of lift the edges a little bit, so that they fade into the background a tiny bit, and that kind of gives it, I don't know, a bit of reflection. Okay, let's move on to another part. So for the face, I think I might give that a little bit more contrast. Something like that. For the skin tone, the skin I think I'm going to deal with at the very end. And I think I might actually do a part 2 where I can continue to work on this and get into some other materials, because rendering does take a long time, especially when you want to go for a pretty high fidelity finish. But it is important to really take your time. And so yeah, I think I'm gonna call it here for this part. We are a little over 2 hours in, and I will do a part 6, I guess, which will be just the second part of rendering. I might continue working on it, just rendering some stuff until we get to part 6, where we can add the final touches. Can talk a little bit about material variation or color variation, sorry, in for the different materials, and yeah, bringing this concept to a finish. So yeah, so thanks for hanging around. I hope you learned something this episode, and yeah, looking forward to wrapping up this character. So see you in the next one. Ciao.